Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening to take a look at the Rostoy modernization model. Now, this model looks at the stages that countries go through as they become more developed. And so, one thing that I want to point out right now is that there's a really strong crossover between the Rostoy modernization model and the world systems theory, also known as the core periphery model from Immanuel Wallerstein. There's also a strong correlation with the demographic transition model as well. So as we're going through each of these, because we're going to examine all 5 stages of this model, I want you to think, what stage of the DTM is this going to be? Is this going to be core, periphery, semi-periphery? So I want you to start to think about that. So let's get started. Rostoy developed this model in 1960, and here's the definition. It is a linear theory of development that developed countries go through a common pattern of structural change. Here are the stages. Stage 1, traditional society. Stage 2, transitional stage. Stage 3, takeoff. Stage 4, drive to maturity. Stage 5, high mass consumption. It explains the development experience of Western countries and is a general model for many others. Now, from that definition, which comes from one of our textbooks, I do want to point out a couple of different things. Stage 2 you might see as another name. Okay, they have it in the definition as the transitional stage. We're going to call it preconditions to takeoff. So you have to set the stage, you have to get all the conditions right in order to stage 3 take off. So it's preconditions to take off. And then that stage 5, they list it as high mass consumption. You're also going to see it as the age of mass consumption. So just as a general rule, essentially what this is an attempt to explain the stages that a country goes through as it moves from an LDC periphery country to an MDC core country. All right, so these are the stages: traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, and age of mass consumption. So let's look at each of these individually. So as we go through, there's a lot of different characteristics that we're going to talk about. And so we're going to start out by, first off, describing the situation in each of these stages. Then we'll give you a country that's currently in that stage. We'll talk about when the United States was in this stage. And then we'll give some drivers for change called the impetus for change. And then some barriers to change, things that might slow this down. All right? And so as we go through this, again, I want you to think, what stage of the DTM are we talking about? Is it core, periphery, semi-periphery? So on every one of these slides, I want those 2 characteristics. Then, as we go through this, think of example countries. I'm going to give you one for each stage, but come up with another one or a list of a couple. And then add additional information as we go. So stage 1 is the traditional society. From an economic standpoint, we see that it is predominantly engaged in the primary sector, especially subsistence agriculture. So we're not seeing the shift to commercial agriculture yet. Very limited production. There's not much coming out of the secondary sector. From a social standpoint, it's a very hierarchical and rigid social structure, so class systems in place. From a political standpoint, there's a lot of regional power rather than central power. So a lot of regional decision making, and landowners are very powerful. And on the cultural side, resistant to change. We mentioned that from a social standpoint, a very rigid social structure, it's not likely to change in stage 1. All right, and a very big focus on tradition. And another thing that we tend to see in stage 1, this is something that Rostoy actually said about stage 1, is that a very high percentage of the country's resources are devoted to what he called, quote, non-productive activities. And he listed a couple of those non-productive activities, things like the military and religion. Now that can get kind of controversial, but essentially what he was referencing is that there's no output from that. There's no finished goods that come from that could then improve the country developmentally, economically. And so they're spending a lot of money on those kind of what he called non-productive activities. So a country that's currently in this stage is Afghanistan. But I want you to think, what's another country that spends a very high percentage of their economy on the military? Okay, what country spends a disproportionate amount of their money on the military and is very developmentally behind? And hopefully you thought of North Korea. Because North Korea, very little infrastructure, and what they do have is very, very poor. They spent a ton on military research and their military, at the expense of all other elements of their society. So North Korea is another good example. Now in the United States, this was where we were prior to independence, when we were still the colonies. All right, and early on in U.S. history, we have very little industrial output. The Industrial Revolution has not yet diffused to North America. So most of the work was agricultural, even in the North. Now, even after independence, we had a system of governance in the United States prior to the U.S. Constitution called the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, individual states had a lot more decision-making ability. That's a great example of that regional decision-making. The individual states had a lot of authority, and the central government wasn't very powerful. And under the very first election under the U.S. Constitution, really only white male property owners were able to vote. And at that time, that was about 6% of the U.S. population that was able to actually vote in elections. 6%. And so that's a great example of that rigid and hierarchical social structure. The fact that landowners are powerful, so some evidence there. So the current impetus for change, what's going to drive countries to change, a lot of it is external, all right? External influences, external interests, and external markets. So, being able to ship out and things like that. As far as barriers to change, we're seeing especially a lack of technology can be an issue. The lack of industrialization is a big problem. Obviously, it's the lowest stage of development, so that's a problem. And demographics can be an issue as well. Low life expectancy, very high birth rates, high total fertility rates, high infant mortality rates. So a lot of those characteristics can have a negative impact on a country and hold them back developmentally. So think, what stage of the demographic transition model are we likely talking about here? In stage 2, we're talking about preconditions to take off. So setting the stage to take off, which is stage 3. All right. So under stage 2, preconditions to take off. In the economic sphere, we're talking about a surplus in agriculture. So you're starting to produce a little bit more than just what is needed to feed your people. We see an expansion in the secondary sector, still not a huge portion of the economy, but it's expanding, and more trade. Because remember, that was one of the impetus for change in stage 1 was external markets. So now we're starting to see more trade as a characteristic of stage 2. On the social side, we're starting to see commercial classes emerge. We're starting to see a little bit of urbanization, so we're starting to see cities start to pop up, or maybe one very big city, that kind of thing. What we will call in the next unit a primate city might be characteristic of stage 2. From the political standpoint, we're seeing a more centralized national government. And so we're going to talk about what that means here in just a minute. And then on the cultural side, we're starting to see a little bit more progress. If stage 1 was very rigid and very traditional, in stage 2, we're starting to see a little bit more openness. We're starting to see a little bit more progress when it comes to society and cultural values and things like that. So a country that I would say is probably very late stage 2 and perhaps even moving into stage 3 right now is India. And so I want you to think, what's another country that would be very, very characteristic of stage 2? They're setting the stage to industrialize. They're setting the stage to take off. What might be an even better country than even India to use as an example of stage 2 of Rostoi's modernization model. And in the United States, the first half of the 1800s, the first half of that century, is when we saw that the United States was in this preconditioned takeoff. And so at this time, the Industrial Revolution has diffused to the United States. So we start seeing the secondary sector begin to emerge, especially in the northern states. The southern states, still very much agricultural, plantations, things like that. The U.S. Constitution created a much stronger central government than we had under the Articles of Confederation. But there were challenges to how strong that central government was going to be very early on. A great example of that would be the Whiskey Rebellion. And under the Whiskey Rebellion, it was a popular uprising in Pennsylvania over taxes that were imposed on whiskey. And so rural farmers, the most efficient way to transport their surplus corn was to distill it into whiskey. And so the national government placed a tax on this, and the farmers were upset by this. And so there was a challenge to the national government about whether or not they were going to pay this tax that was imposed on the farmers. And the central government showed up under President Washington and put down this rebellion, air quotes, but popular uprising to be sure. And it really kind of demonstrated the stronger central government under this U.S. Constitution than we had under the Articles of Confederation. As far as on the cultural side, the progressive side of stage 2, a couple good examples would be the Seneca Falls Convention that took place during the first half of the 1800s. It's a great example of that progressive movement. We also saw other movements like the temperance movement that challenged kind of traditional values and things like that. But the Seneca Falls Convention and what came out of the Seneca Falls Convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, sought to extend the right to vote to women amongst other rights as well. And so that was something where it was more progressive for that time. So that kind of explains some of the events in U.S. history that goes along with stage 2. Now, when it comes to what's going to move you past stage 2 and into stage 3, the impetus for change, building up that infrastructure, having a road network, it might be railroads as you industrialize, things like that. We start to see certain political and social classes emerge and having a more prominent voice. What might hinder a movement into stage 3 would be a lack of investment, especially a lack of investment in infrastructure. Roads, railroads, even now it might be airports, ports, things like that, might keep a country from taking off, as it were. Speaking of takeoff, stage 3. So here's what we're seeing in stage 3 of Rostoi's modernization model. And again, what stage of the demographic transition model are we talking about? Core, periphery, semi-periphery at this stage. Be thinking about that. I want that on each of these 5 stages. What do we see? So in stage 3, from an economic standpoint, we're seeing rapid growth of the secondary sector of industry, but really only in a few different areas. So we see rapid industrialization, but just of a few different activities where a lot of investment has taken place and things like that. We start to see new technologies emerge within those sectors, and we start to see a shift to commercial agriculture. On the social side, we start to see that, again, we mentioned that certain social classes are starting to emerge. Well, in stage 3, that is the entrepreneurial class that is beginning to emerge as a very dominant force within a country. On the political side, we start to see movements towards modernization, employing the secondary sector and infrastructure to modernize as a country. And then finally, on the cultural side, we start to see investments taking place, and those investments designed for profit. And that's going to help improve modernization. That's probably going to help include or improve the secondary sector. That's going to help improve infrastructure. So there's the conscious choice to improve those areas. So a country that's currently in stage 3 would be Thailand, would be a good example. But come up with another example. What other country is currently in stage 3. Now, as far as the United States, we say the middle of the 1800s, but really I'm talking about the second half into the late 1800s. And in the United States, especially after the Civil War, we started to see the emergence of the entrepreneurial class. But again, really only in certain areas. Okay, a couple people that became very prominent at this time. Cornelius Vanderbilt was very prominent with railroads. John D. Rockefeller with oil. Andrew Carnegie with steel are all examples of these individuals in the entrepreneurial class that became especially dominant in the country. Very limited areas, just those 3 areas. Well, not just those 3 areas, but it was still very limited. And so we saw rapid growth in those areas. But there was an ongoing debate, and even still to this day, there's an ongoing debate amongst historians, and perhaps this will be a debate you have in your U.S. history class when you get there, about whether or not these industrialists were captains of industry who were using their power and influence to try and improve the country, or were they robber barons, a term that was applied to them. Both of these terms that were applied to them depending on people's perception of them. Okay? And those that applied the term robber barons believed that these industrialists were using their power to advance their own personal interests rather than the interests of the country. And it's an interesting point of debate. And depending on your perception of them, you might be able to draw some evidence to support that position. But that's where we were, especially in that second half of the 19th century, as we moved into stage 4. So what's going to typically happen as countries move into stage 4 is that they need to start to see the secondary sector making up a larger percentage of their national income. It started to emerge in stage 2, preconditions to take off, but during takeoff, it has to dramatically improve. And so we start to see more modern elements come in, whether those are modern social or political or economic institutions. We start to see, again, that modernization taking place. And what might hinder this is if only one industry is the focal point of this. Okay? By the time we get to stage 4, we're starting to see industrialization take place on a much larger scale. Stage 3, it's very limited. But what needs to happen to get into stage 4 is that economic diversification. We need to see industrialization and modernization taking place in other industries other than just the limited ones of stage 3. By stage 4, this is the drive to maturity. We're seeing new technologies emerge in all sectors. All right, so not the limited sectors of stage 3. Now we're starting to see it industrialize in all sectors. And we're starting to see labor-saving devices begin to emerge and to help with that industrialization process across different areas. On the social side, we're starting to see urbanization and perhaps rapid urbanization. Cities start to grow quite dramatically. And for modern cities, that might not be just a single city, but rather multiple cities growing very, very quickly. We're starting to see more skilled labor, more professional labor, so higher wages typically associated with that. And we're starting to see industrial leaders being very, very influential, having a lot of power. We saw them emerge as dominant in stage 3. Now they're very influential. I'll give you an example from U.S. history here in just a couple minutes. And on the cultural side, we're starting to see the focus on new technologies. We're starting to see the expectation of progress. We started to see the progressive movement begin in stage 2, but now by stage 4, there is an expectation of progress. And again, we'll give some examples from U.S. history. A country that I would say is currently in stage 4 is South Korea. They rapidly industrialized over the last few decades. And now they're in that drive to maturity. So we're starting to see them move very quickly into that developed stage. So what might be another country that's in that same stage, in that drive to maturity? And then, what What demographic transition model stage are we talking about? Is this core, periphery, semi-periphery? What are we talking about here? Now, in the U.S., it's really going to be late 1800s, but I'm going to even extend it into the early part of the 1900s, from like 1890 into like the up to 1920s. So that range is really what we're talking about. And so a couple examples from U.S. history that fit with this stage of Rostoy's modernization model would be the fact that we saw new practices pioneered in industry. For example, Fordism by Henry Ford in the automobile industry led to increased industrial output. We also saw that John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Andrew Carnegie, and by the early part of the 20th century, especially J.P. Morgan. And J.P. Morgan was the leading financier in the United States. By the early part of the 1900s, he was so influential that he and the President of the United States, at that time Teddy Roosevelt, actually went head to head. The President, Teddy Roosevelt, actually sued J.P. Morgan's company, the Northern Security Corporation, over what Roosevelt saw as a monopoly. It went to court, and eventually the court sided with the president, Teddy Roosevelt, and he got this nickname of a trust buster. During the early parts of the 19th century, we had industrialists taking on the leader of the country, and that's how influential they were. And these are names that you still hear to this day. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, Carnegie, like you still hear these names. These individuals were very, very influential. Now, with regards to the expectation of progress, in fact, this era of U.S. history is known as the Progressive Era. From 1890 to 1920 was known as the Progressive Era. During this time, we saw constitutional amendments that granted women the right to vote. We also saw at the very end of this a constitutional amendment that outlawed, quote, intoxicating liquors, known as prohibition, which was later repealed by a later constitutional amendment. But we saw movements to end child labor. We saw movements to improve workers' rights. We saw movements to improve the quality of food production. A great example would be the book The Jungle. Talking about what was happening in these meatpacking plants that led to changes that would improve the quality of the food coming out of these meatpacking plants and in other areas. These are just some of the progressive movements that took place during this period of time and would be great evidence of when the U.S. was in stage 4 of the drive to maturity. Stage 5 is going to be the age of mass consumption. And in the age of mass consumption, we see increased production and consumption of what are known as durable goods. Great example of that would be cars. In U.S. history, we saw mass production of cars. We start to see more people working in the tertiary sector, so service sector. We saw the emergence of the middle class as well as suburbanization. We're going to talk about that from U.S. history. We're seeing very low natural increase rates, very high population numbers, so like high population numbers, but population growth beginning to stabilize. So what stage of the demographic transition model does that sound like? Low natural increase rate, higher population, but stabilizing as growth. It's leveling off. What stage is that? From the political side, we're seeing a push for social welfare programs. We're starting to see more resources devoted to the military and security, maintaining the security of a country. And then we're also seeing increased demand for consumer goods. People now have more money, so we're starting to see people willing to make that commitment. A current country that's in this stage is Japan. This is the stage that the United States is in, Japan is in. What might be another country that's part of this age of mass consumption? Now, in the United States, beginning in the 1920s and into like the 1950s, 1960s to a certain extent, remember that in the 1920s, anyone remember the nickname of the 1920s in U.S. history? They were called the Roaring Twenties because people had this money. They were spending. And so we saw increased demand for these consumer goods. People were spending lots of money. All right. And after World War II especially, we see increased demand for consumer goods, durable consumer goods, like cars and homes. And this then led to the suburbanization movement that we saw in the United States. Because as we were transitioning out of the wartime economy, during World War II, we're producing planes and tanks and cars and all these things for the military effort. After the war is over, we transitioned that into producing consumer goods, like cars. They just kept producing, but they started producing cars, not for the military, but for average Americans. And when you flood the market with anything, what's that going to do to the price? It drove it down, which made it affordable for the middle class. So now they didn't have to live in the city anymore because they could drive into the city. And so we started to see all these houses be built. And so when we have a bunch of houses, what's that going to do to the price of it? It's going to drop it. So now middle class Americans are able to buy houses for the first time out in the suburbs. Add on to this what we saw in the 1950s with the interstate highway system, begun under Eisenhower, and this continued the suburbanization movement. From the social standpoint and the political standpoint, with social welfare programs going back under FDR, Social Security is a great example of that. Hey, if we were to project this into the 1960s, now that is the time that Rostoy was coming up with this, but to a certain extent, we started to see progressive movements like the Civil Rights Movement under JFK and LBJ. So all of these are pieces of evidence to say, okay, this is when America was in these stages. And so we'd want to, if we were to go and look at other countries, we'd look for similar characteristics. Now, the next two slides, this slide and the next slide, are really just great review tools. All right. So what are some notes? What are some observations? Maybe what are some questions that you have on this? But make sure that you know that this slide and next slide are great review tools to help you remember the Rostoy modernization model. Okay, so notice the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector. Okay, as we become more developed, primary sector declines, secondary sector increases, and then slowly starts to stabilize and then decline. And then in the tertiary sector, it takes a long time, but by the time you become a MDC core country, the vast majority of the population is working in the tertiary sector. On this particular slide, we've got lots of information. Okay, so we get characteristics about the economic growth of a country. Hey, what's happening to its society? Hey, what's happening to its technology? What's happening politically? What's happening with industry? What's happening with investment? This is a great snapshot of what the Rostoy modernization model is supposed to be. Okay, so this is a great place to go and just quick review tool for Rostoy's modernization model. Now, as with most things, there are issues that go along with this. All right. The first one is that this model was developed in the 1960s and based on the United States and Europe, which doesn't mean that that's the case for every country on earth. It's not applicable everywhere. And it doesn't take into account the impact of colonization in LDCs and the impact that it had on development. On transportation systems, on infrastructure, the fact that colonial capitals developed much faster and led themselves to becoming primate cities. So it doesn't take into account that. It ignores other elements of culture that may impact development. All right, and it takes out some of those outside factors that might influence it. For example, war. It doesn't account what might happen to a country if there is a conflict, if there is a civil war in a country, political movements, popular uprising, culture, supranational organizations. It doesn't take into account any of these different things that might have an impact on the level of development in a country. It automatically makes this connection with greater levels of development and mass consumption. And in particular, environmentalists disagree with this. All right. Environmentalists believe that as countries become more developed, they become more aware of the dangers of mass consumption. Okay, the impact that it can have on the environment, perhaps. And this just assumes that we're going to continue mass consuming forever. And so a great question that I would ask would be, what might stage 6 look like? Rostoy ended this in the 1960s. Well, we've changed a lot since then. So if we were to add a 6th stage, what might that look like? And that's a really good question to kind of end this lecture on, is what might that stage 6 look like? So take a moment as we end here and just think, what are we doing now here in the United States? What characteristics might define us economically, politically, socially, culturally? How have things changed? And I'll leave you with that. Have a wonderful evening, everyone, and I'll see you back in class.